Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Lewis for friends, and today we're going to talk about socialism. Socialism is a topic that has been long explored by scholars, philosophers, economists, my neighbor Buzz, and everyone has an opinion on it. So before we start, let's dispel a couple of myths. Myth number one, socialism does not simply apply to a nation's economy or politics. It is a philosophy and a worldview, and because of that, it applies to all facets of life. The foundation of socialism assumes that all men are basically good, and that the reason men act and behave badly is because society corrupted them. So according to socialist thought, if we fix society, then we can fix humanity. Injustice would then cease to be. We will all live happily ever after in our little houses made out of cake and buttercream frosting, and we'd never get fat, and then we'd sing everything is awesome 24/7, 7 days a week. Number two, Karl Marx did not invent socialism. Yes, we attribute him to the most well-known and radical of the socialist ideas, and he is an incredibly influential figure in the history of socialism. However, the concept of socialism can be found as early as the ancient Greeks, when Plato, in his book Republic, wrote that in order for society to work at maximum efficiency, that citizen labor should be state-run and that decisions for the people would be made by the governing class. That included determining jobs, marriages, and state ownership of children. Now, he did advocate a two-class society, those who govern and those who are governed, in which the governors would come from the privileged aristocratic class. Not sure if Plato and Karl would get along very well. I mean, they both had great beards, so I guess they could talk about, beard hygiene. Moving forward to the Renaissance, English author Sir Thomas More wrote about an ideal community guided by reason in his book Utopia, and guess what he based his philosophy on? The problematic situation of European politics and, oh yeah, Plato's Republic. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Now, to be fair to Karl Marx, the time period he lived in was ideal to the acceptance, or at least the consideration of socialist beliefs. More on that later. Third, communism is not the only type of socialism, and not all socialists are communist. Communism is the most radical form of socialism, and it was outlined and made popular by our buddy Karl Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. However, there are many different branches of socialism, including utopian socialism, Fabian socialism, anarchism, social democracy, democratic socialism, and Christian socialism. Each of those categories have subcategories that have subcategories, but I digress. Socialism in general is based on benefiting society as a whole rather than individuals and opposing or attacking capitalism. So why do socialists hate capitalism so much? Let's take a look at that. You should remember from previous lessons that capitalism, at its core, is an economic system based on private ownership of a business or factory that produces goods for a profit. The business owner has the freedom to make decisions that benefit their company, and that means assessing costs, which would be production, wages, shipping, and setting competitive prices for their product to maximize their profit. There is a high amount of risk in capitalism, but maybe that's why the great Ron Swanson defined capitalism as God's way of determining who is smart and who is poor. The history of capitalism in Europe follows this basic timeline. It emerged in the Renaissance through merchants selling goods in markets, growing into mercantilism in the 16th through 18th centuries as European nations gained colonies overseas using their raw materials to produce manufactured goods. Eventually, it culminated to what we know of as industrial capitalism in the late 18th century, primarily in Great Britain. Industrial capitalism replaced the merchants with industrialists, or your business owners, factory owners, and focused more attention on the factory system and mass production. These factories utilized workers who worked long hours and in oftentimes dangerous conditions for very, very little money. So why is that? Remember, low costs equal high profit for factory owners. So sometimes they would cut corners like not putting on protective coverings on machinery. Eventually, British Parliament initiated some reforms, lowering work hours, raising wages, and regulating factories. However, there was still a great gap between the wealth of factory owners and their workers. So the philosophy of socialism became a popular idea amongst the working class. Now let's introduce three types of socialism that became popular during this time. The first type of socialism we'll examine is called utopian socialism. Now, the utopian socialists didn't actually use the word utopian in their description. They just considered themselves as socialists. That nickname was actually given to them by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, almost in a mocking way. The reason why they were referred to as utopian socialists was how they believed their world could operate. They believed that if the iniquities or injustices in society could be abolished, then man's natural goodness could be perfected. Proper surroundings and good education would ultimately solve all problems. One of the most notable supporters of this type of socialism was Robert Owen, a budding entrepreneur who set up utopian communities for his workers in Scotland and New Harmony, Indiana. Both of these utopian societies failed very quickly due to division and people's selfishness. The second type of socialism we'll examine is Marxism. Marxism gets its name from its founder, Karl Marx, who grew up the son of a prominent German lawyer. Despite his father's urgings, Karl studied philosophy and history, and through his academic career found himself developing rather radical political views. It was because of these political views that he really struggled to find employment, and after publishing some controversial journal entries, he was soon banned from his homeland of Prussia. Karl soon after fled to Paris, France, a revolutionary meeting point for many, and soon met Friedrich Engels. Engels and Marx soon collaborated together to write the Communist Manifesto, which was published amid revolutions across Europe in 1848. The general belief of Marxism is that all of history is dominated by class struggle. You might think back to the Roman times with the plebeians versus the patricians, or the Middle Ages with the lower class versus the privileged nobility. In his time, he called the lower class the proletariat. This would be workers from factories or farms, and they would struggle against the bourgeoisie, or the middle class landowners and capitalists. Marx believed that this struggle between classes would finally end when the proletariat violently overthrew the bourgeoisie. He believed that under communism, these struggles would cease, that eventually the proletariat, as this dictating class, would eventually eliminate all class distinctions. One of the distinctions that Karl Marx actively targeted was religion, which he called the opiate of the people. Under communism, everyone would become one in society in order to erase capitalism. Once all obstacles were taken out, man would become perfect in a perfect society and would no longer need a state to govern him. In our world today, we've seen communism pursued by several nations, including the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam. The third type of socialism we'll examine is Fabian socialism. This particular brand of socialism came from Great Britain, from British socialists who thought that revolution was a bit much. Fabian socialists got their name from Quintus Fabius Maximus, who was a Roman general who fought against Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Instead of taking Hannibal on directly, he targeted his supply lines and fought small battles that he knew his army could take on. Fabian tactics were then applied to society, and Fabian socialists believed the best way to destroy capitalism was to undermine it gradually rather than overthrow it. So instead of violent revolution, they would pass laws through parliament that slowed down capitalist ideas. These are summaries of much larger ideas that have been expanded upon over centuries, but hopefully these shortened descriptions will give a good starting point for discussion. When it comes to philosophies, there's not one human philosophy that can be used to solve mankind's problems. Oftentimes, governments and societies use a mix of worldviews to operate, and even then they fail to address everyone's issues. Ultimately, we live in a fallen world marred by sin, and the best that we can do is examine Scripture, apply it to our lives, and live for Christ. Until next time, thanks for watching. Josie, you're making an earthquake here. Thank you. You nut! What am I gonna do with you? What am I gonna do?